All right, I believe I am taping, so give me a second to set my, oops. Share. I'll do that right now. All right, so I'm going to start. I'm assuming right now, if you're looking on the screen, that you can see my thing on JavaScript cheat sheet array methods. If you can't see that, if anybody could just give me a yell, but if I don't hear anything, I'll assume that you understand that. All right, you can see that. All right, so I'm going to start up right now by talking about this. What's going to happen is hopefully I have enough material to get to our first break, and I can't find my other material that I created. So hopefully I saved it, I backed it up, and I'll have to look for that during the break. All right, that said, okay, yesterday was an introduction. We didn't talk about all that much, but what I want to do um, by the end of this week is basically be done reviewing JavaScript. Now, that said, we're going to be using JavaScript throughout the entire semester. And I know a couple of you have even emailed me and talked to me about some of your hesitations, saying that in the AWD1111 class, you understood HTML, you understood CSS, but you had some problems with JavaScript. Well, one of the reasons that we're going over some of this stuff is to review, but there will be some stuff that we'll discuss in here today that we haven't looked at a lot that we're going to look at. All right. So I've got this. I've got another one on string methods, and I've prepared a worksheet for you to work on. You won't have to turn it in, but I want you to get used to especially some of the ES6 array methods. And when you look on the list right here, all right, the only one that really jumps out to me is map. Well, I guess two of map and filter. So we're going to talk about those, and we'll talk about a few other things. Again, I have a lot more notes on this stuff that I better be able to find. I don't know how I didn't, I don't know. It's missing in action, but I'll try to find them. So you've got this. This is in that handout of stuff that I asked to you, or I gave to you yesterday. But I'm going to go over it now. A lot of the things that are in here, you probably understand. You all understand sort, you all understand reverse, etc. So you should get those. All right, you should be able to use those without any problem. But a lot of the ES6 things, filter and map and rest and spread and reduce, those we have not talked too much about. Most of those are mentioned if you still have your old AWD 1000 JavaScript book, they're in there. All right. But we didn't talk about them a lot because that was stuff near the end of the book and it was near the end of the semester and we were, whatever. All right. So let's talk about some of them now. Now, on this thing, every time they show something, they've got an example. All right. So, as an example here, and you all know this, and again, in many ways, for part of this lecture, I'm preaching to the choir. JavaScript is unique in the languages that we teach here at Rankin, in that with JavaScript, your arrays can hold multiple different types of items. So even though on here it has two different arrays that they're concatenating together, and each array is an array of strings, this example they show right here would work just fine if, for example, the first array was strings and the second array was numbers, and you had a third array that was Booleans, etc. That shouldn't be a surprise to any of you. All right. When you use concat, as it says, you're not changing the existing array. In other words, you concatenate two arrays together and you put the results in a new array. And to my knowledge, you can chain this. So if I had a third array up here, I could say hege.concat stale.concat, and I could put another one. You can keep doing that. All right. So again, I'm not sure if we looked much at concat, but this is just one of those things that, again, you should be familiar with. Here's another one, copy within. Copies array elements to another position in the array, overwriting the existing value. All right. And it says this in this example does override or overwrite the original array. Are we going to use that? Probably not, but it's at least something you should look at. All right. Now, this particular example, it's not so much that this is important, but one thing that you are going to have to understand in order to be able to make it through this class, make it through successfully, and have it make some sense to you is the idea of using JSON. And JSON is JavaScript object notation. You can go out, I think it's json.org. It's not a very meaningful website, to be honest with you. But the idea, what we're going to be using in here, I'll show it up here, but you're going to be creating something like you might say, let, with a little L, people equals, and then you'll come in here and we'll probably have an array, but it'll be an array of objects. This is how you typically set it up. So we'll have something in here for it. This is just an example, but you might have something like first name, Jeff, last name, Scott, age, 65. And then you'd come in here and you do another one and you do another one. So, I could put my wife in here. That kind of thing. And I could keep going. The idea, though, is this. If you don't see it right now, I can change my screen, but you should be able to. So again, we're working with key value pairs. This is the key. This is the value. Key, value, etc. You can have as many of these as you want to. But what you're going to find out is a lot of the times we're going to be going out to an API, to an application program interface. We are going to be grabbing data from that API. That data that we grab will be in a format like this. In other words, it will be in a JSON format. All right. And it's not that this is exactly ugly, but what would be nice would be if we could take this JSON and we could convert it basically into strings and just put it into HTML. You can do that. You will be doing a lot of that. All right. Okay. Every. There's a few things in here. Notice it says the every method checks all array elements to see that they pass a test. So in other words, when you look at this example right here, this should make sense to you. This example will return false. All right. What does that mean? Well, it's an everyone. So does every age that's in here, or is every age in here greater than or equal to 18? It's not. So we use the name of the array dot every, and then we call a function. So this is an example here of passing a function as a parameter. All right. You're going to see a boatload of this stuff this semester. But again, to be honest with you, this is a fairly simplistic example. You should be able to look at it, all right, and between what's shown here and the comments, it should make sense to you. If we removed this one right here, the one with 16 on it, it would return true. But since we have one that is less than 18, it returns false. All right. Fill, as it says, specifies fills the specified elements in the array with a static value. I don't know why you'd want to use this, except this would be one way if you wanted to create, let's say, a numeric array that you wanted to make sure was initialized to all zeros, you could do that. All right. Typically, when you create an array in JavaScript and it's a numeric array, if you don't give it initial values, they'll be initialized to 0 anyway. But if you wanted to double check or verify, this would be a way that you could do it. All right. So here's the first one that's an important one, so to speak, and it's filter. So the first thing to notice here when you look at it is it says it creates an array with all the elements that pass a test. So we've got an array here, all right, that's called ages. And this is the test. So what we're telling it to do is we're telling it to filter this out. Normally we'd put this into a new array. But the idea here is we're telling it right here, go through every array element. If that array element is greater than or equal to 18, include it in our list. If that is not greater than or equal to 18, do not include it in the list. The reason that that's important is a lot of times what's going to happen, especially when we get into where we are talking about databases and the like, and where you do a query and you'll have a lot of information that's going to be returned. All right. So let's suppose that we created an application, and it doesn't matter if it's MySQL or a different database, but let's say it was MySQL, and we had 1,000 employees at a company. All right. And let's say that the employees were each employee was in a department, whatever that department was, shipping, receiving, accounting, programming, it doesn't matter. But if we wanted to filter and just grab in here, we could say something like return department equals IT. All right, so it would go through all those records. So the idea here, what I'm trying to get across to you is what it's doing here is it goes through every array element. One thing we're going to get used to, or should get used to if you haven't been doing it, is when you create an array with multiple elements, pluralize it. So put an S on the end, or ES, depending on how it is. But when you're checking them, then use the singular version. You don't have to do this. You could have called this Ralph and this Ralph. It would have worked just fine. That said, this is the way it's typically done. And one of the things I'm really trying to stress to you is to do things the way that they're typically done. I probably have told one or more of you listening to this lecture this before, but I'll always, remember that I had a student years ago, and he had a job interview. He was a little bit old. Well, he was a lot older, really. He was probably 50 years old when he went through the program. This was before I was at Rankin. And he had an interview upon graduation. Now, this guy was in the military, so he was very rigid in the way he was, but just a really, really smart guy. And I said, well, why don't you come in this afternoon? It was during the summer. And I said, come in during the afternoon, tell me how the interview went. So he came in and he didn't look happy. So I knew he didn't get it. And I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, everything was going fine. Then he asked me if I had any questions. And I said, no, but I said, I looked at your website and I've got some recommendations for you. When you go into a company, you don't want to come in with a big hammer and say, hey, I'm here, I'm your savior, I'm going to fix everything. You want to fit in when you first get into a company. Then when you make a name for yourself and people start realizing your talent, then you can bring up things that you think should change. So the reason I told you that was, again, because what I want is to teach you things and show you the way they're typically done, so you will fit in. All right, so that's filter. Then there's find. Now notice the find returns the number of the first element in the array that passes a test. All right, so what's the first element in the array that's greater than or equal to 18? Well, it's element 2, right? So it'll return that occurrence, 0, 1, 2. If we would have went in here and it would have asked, for example, to return age greater than or equal to 30, none of them would meet the criteria. So by default, it will return -1. And again, these are just things that, for lack of better verbiage, they have to start making sense to you. All right. Okay. Find index. As it says, it returns the index of the first array element that passes a test. So this returns the value. This returns the index of the value. So where this one would return 18, this one would return 2. All right. For each, again, these are just considered the ways that you really should be doing things. As it says, you can use for each to call a function once for each element in an array. What's the important takeaway there? The important takeaway is for each is meant to work with collections such as an array. So this numbers.for each, we're calling my function. So it's going to call my function the first time, and when it calls it, it's going to be passing in 65. When it calls it the second time, 44, the third time, 12, etc. Now, this is kind of a silly example because all it's doing is it's taking each element and multiplying it by 10. All right. And it's actually creating a new array right there. All right. Typically, you would do that. Technically, it's not creating a new array, but you'd put it into one. But it is, in this case, it is changing it. So the output is from numbers. It was originally 65, 44, 12, and 4, and it's now 10 times each one of those numbers. All right. Includes, as it says, determines whether or not an array contains a specified element. So it returns a Boolean. All right. So it's going to return true or false. Not only that, you can tell it which position to start at. If you leave that off, it'll start at the beginning. All right. Index of, we already kind of talked about this. There's a couple different variations of index of, so I'll just leave that one alone. Is array, as it says, determines whether or not an object is an array or is not an array. And boy, I don't know what happened there, but that should say the function returns true if the object is an array and false if it's not an array. All right. Join converts the elements of an array into a string. So what is that doing? Okay, it's taking this, which are 4 different entities, and it's joining it into one entity, and the delimiter between each one is and. So this is an array that contains 4 string elements. This is a string that contains all of that. All right. Last index of is the same thing as index of, but it finds the last one in a list as opposed to the first one in a list with index of. Map, this is another one you're going to have to learn. All right. Creates a new array. That's the important thing with map. Creates a new array with the results of calling a function for every array element. So we're taking this original numbers array, we're grabbing every number that's in there, and we're running the square root function on that particular number. So as you can see, this becomes this. All right, because the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of 9 is 3, etc. All right, push and pop, 2 more that you just have to get used to. Pop removes the last array element. All right, push is going to end up putting an element onto the end of the array. So pop grabs the last one off. Pop is most often associated with using a stack. So when you look at this, banana, orange, apple, mango, which was the last one that was put on there? Mango. So if you call pop, that's the one that gets removed. All right. Push, as I mentioned, adds new items to the end of the array. It also updates the length, and I believe so does this one. Even if it doesn't say it, it'll update the length. All right. So as you can see right there, when you get done with this and you push, now you've got 5 elements, those being 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right. Reduce is another one that you have to learn or have to start understanding. using reduce, using the spread operator, etc. We're going to look at some of those in just a bit. So as it says there, reduce executes a function for each value from right to left, and it reduces the array to a single value. Typically, the reason that you use reduce is you want to take a numeric array with a bunch of elements in it, and you want to get an aggregate or a single value result. So in this case, I want to grab all 4 of these elements, add them together, and return the sum. All right. So what are we doing here? We're calling reduce. We're passing it 2 parameters. It is possible to pass it more, just so you know. We'll see some examples of that, just not right now. Get sum is going to be called for each one of these, and this is telling it to start at 0. So the first time through, it'll be 0 plus 15.5. Then the next time through, it'll be 15.5 plus 2.3, etc. All right. Reduce right, as it says, I don't think I've ever used this. It executes a provided function for each array value and reduces it to a single value. Like I said, I don't think I've ever used that. I was wondering if we had somebody trying to get in because my machine just beeped at me. So, doggone it. All right. Sum, as it says right here, the sum method checks if anything passes a test. So this is saying, do any of the numbers in here, are any of the numbers greater than or equal to 18? So again, when you start using some of these functions that we've been discussing, it's going to be important because quite often there are going to be multiple ways that you can get the data as you're perusing your way through a list of data, be it a database or something else, and you only want data that meets a certain criteria. This is one way that you will be able to do it. All right. There's slice, as it says. It selects the elements of an array given at a starting point, all right, to an endpoint, and it creates, it says it returns the elements in an array as a new array object. All right, so it is not designed to change the original array. If we wanted to change this array that you see right here, let's assume, for example, we wanted to remove orange. So we wanted to just say banana, lemon, apple, and mango. We wouldn't use slice. We would call fruits.splice with a P in there. We tell it to start at location 1, and we would tell it to go 1 location. All right. Okay. Now, whereas push and pop either add something to the end of an array or remove something from the end of the array. All right. Shift removes the first item in an array, and unshift will remove the last item in an array. I know why they use those names, I'm not sure. Push and pop, to me at least, actually makes some sense. Shift and unshift, that's a little harder. All right. Sort we've worked with before. Again, as it says, the sort method sorts the items in an array. Splice, I've already mentioned to you. JavaScript has a toString function. We use the toString function a lot in C#. Notice what this does. It returns a string with all the array elements separated by commas, if for some reason you've got a reason to do that. All right. Unshift, as we just about are finished with this one, as it says, adds new items to the beginning of an array. I think I already mentioned that. Value of, it says the value of method returns the array. This method is the default method of the array object. All right, it returns, if you call it, it's just going to return what you already got, for lack of better words. Now, in just a little bit, we're going to take a break, and after we take the break, or while you're on the break, I am going to email you a worksheet that's going to ask you to use some of these. All right. If you don't like the explanations that are on here, as always, you can go out to W3 Schools and go through their tutorial on JavaScript, or you can go out to the Mozilla Developer Network, and there's other places that you can go as well. All right. All right. I want to switch right now, so I'm going to have to switch my share with you. And this is similar, but these are string methods. Now, I'm going to go through this faster than I did the other one because a lot of these should just make sense to you. All right. You'll notice that they don't have the two uppercase and the two lower. They use the locale. And we'll talk about that in just a minute, but they work pretty much the same way. All right. So, charat, you should understand and be totally comfortable with using this charat function. I have given you several examples in the AWD1111 class, and I'm sure Mr. Gudmiston must have done something similar to this if you add him for the class. That if what I often did was at the end of a program, if you ask if you wanted to run it again, I would tell you to enter a Y or an N. Y for yes, N for no. But sometimes, even though you ask a person to enter a Y, they put yes in there anyway. So charat 0 would just pluck off that first character. Not only that, oftentimes you take the charat and then at the end of it, you put like a dot to uppercase or something like that. All right. Charcodat is the same way, but it returns the Unicode of it. If for some reason you're working with Unicode values. All right. Concat, we've already talked about, used to join two or more strings together. Works the same way with strings as it did with arrays. All right. Ends with determines whether a string ends with character specified. This can be unbelievably helpful using a string method like this if, again, you are looking through a list of values for only ones that meet a certain criteria. All right. So a lot of the other things that we worked with and we just looked at were very similar to these, but these are working on just strings, where the first one that I went through with you, and maybe I should have flipped the order. All right. Those were working on actually arrays. All right. From char code, as it says, converts Unicode characters into, quote, regular characters. Includes, does a string contain specified characters? So again, as you've already seen, there are quite often many different ways of achieving the same result. In here, if you're asked to do something and there's 6 different ways of doing it, I'm not going to recommend any one over any of the others. What I'd recommend is you use the one that is the most intuitive and straightforward to you. And hopefully that just makes sense. All right. So index of gives you the first occurrence. Last index of gives you the last occurrence. These examples are very similar to the ones that you just saw. But again, here we're working with strings, where previously we were working with arrays of strings. All right. Locale can be important because locale is basically the part of the world that you're in. Things that can be important with locale. I mean, there are some places in the world where we read from left to right. There are some places in the world where they read from right to left, for example. All right. Match, as it says, searches a string for a match against a regular expression. By now, my hope is that you understand the concepts of regular expressions. Typically, you use a regular expression to search a string for a string that's inside of it, or a list of strings for a string that's inside of it. And I know I gave you this before, but if we were to go out to, I think it's regular expression .info, I could be wrong here, we'll find out. Yep, that's it. One of the uglier sites you probably have ever seen. All right. But when you go in here, you can go down and you can go by language. And as an example, when we look in here, there's JavaScript. And this is going to have most everything that you need in here as far as being able to run regular expression functions in JavaScript. All right. So it's another thing that you should at least have a comfort level with. Oops. Try that again. All right. Repeat. Yeah. If you just want to repeat a bunch of stuff, replace. I mean, those things should make sense to you already. Search, as it says, search is a specified string for a value. So these search, splice, slice, etc., they have equivalents both for working on a single string and for working on an array of strings. All right. Split, as it says, splits a string into an array of substrings. So split is basically the opposite of the join we looked at before. Split is known as an exploding function. Join is known as an imploding function because bringing stuff together as opposed to pushing stuff apart. There was a start and ends with before. Here's the starts with. There are at least probably a half dozen different ways that you can use a substring, be it substr, substring, or one of the other variants, to find a string of characters within a bigger string of characters. Again, I mentioned this before with the locale. You can see on here that this has got locale lowercase and locale uppercase. All right. And it says according to the host's current locale, but just as though there's a locale lowercase and a locale uppercase, there's a regular lowercase and a regular uppercase. All right. One thing I really tried to implore upon you when we were doing some work using JavaScript, and I'm going to keep doing it, is get used to, before you go in and you want to check something, all right, to see if there's a match or if there's a presence or an absence of something, run the trim function. There are still people who will try to get away with things. I have mentioned this kind of thing to you before, that one of the reasons that the trim function came about is it used to be that when people would put a form out there on the internet, they would make every single field a required field. But this was before HTML5, and you didn't have the required option you could use in HTML. So what a lot of people ended up doing was if they didn't want to fill something out, they would just hit the space bar when they were in certain fields. And if you didn't run trim on it, it would take that. So it would basically record the fact that you put a space in there, which at least conceivably, if you're going to throw stuff into a database, can have fairly devastating consequences. All right, that's it for that. And my guess is you probably say, yeah, that's it for that. I didn't really learn much. And I get it. But I don't want anybody in here to say, well, you didn't go over some of this stuff that we talked about last year, because that's what I'm trying to do right now. All right. I know you probably lost the share. You're going to pick it up again in just a second. We are going to take a break a little bit early. We're going to take it at 1:45, just so I can try to recover the rest of my stuff. And let me go and share this. All right. I'm going to give you this, and you will have some time today to work on it. You don't have to turn this in, but there are 15 or 16 questions in here that are asking you to create some stuff. All right. And you will be using map, and you will be using reduce, and you will be using the spread operator, and you will be using the rest operator, and you will be using the filter operator. So again, as I mentioned to you before, if these are foreign to you, you're going to have to go out either to W3 schools, go to the JavaScript tutorial, and just go in and start looking up the ES6 functions, and they should be in there with examples. All right. Otherwise, you can always go out to dev.mozilla.org, all right, which is basically the Mozilla page or the Mozilla site for everything. All right. So there's going to be, I don't know, I thought it was 16. It's about 5 pages long. Yeah, the last, oh, 15, no, 16, there we go. So what I'm going to do during the break is I'm going to send this to you. You don't have to do it today. You don't ever have to do it. But what's going to happen in here, just so you know, what's going to happen in here on Friday. Yes, Friday is going to be a lab day, but if you want to take part in it, I am going to go over the answers to these 16 things, and I'm going to ask you to do another 2 or 3 little mini projects that, again, will not be graded so much, but I will go over them on the lab day. All right. What I want is by next week, when we get to next Monday, I want to jump right back into MySQL, and we'll spend 1 to 2 weeks on MySQL. We're going to get a little node in there too, a little node.js, and then we're going to jump into MongoDB with, again, a little bit more Node in there. Then we'll hit Node hot and heavy, including Express and some other things. And that's what we'll spend the majority of the semester on. But somewhere around week 10 at the latest, I want to bring React into the equation. And my hope is we will create some kind of a website as a class, all right, that will be, it might be an e-commerce site or something similar to that. All right. And we will get it to a certain point, and then I will say, okay, now I want you to take it and I want you to make it yours. All right. So you can change your colors, you can change the fonts, you can change the pictures, you can change whatever the site's about, etc. Because again, I want it to be yours. All right. So I will send you this during the break. I apologize. I'm going to look for my stuff right now. When you come back from the break, hopefully I'll have my head out of my butt and I'll be able to give you the rest of this stuff. So although it's a little early, it's 12:46. Let's just plan on meeting back up at 1 o'clock, and I'll see you then. All right, I'm back. I hope you're all back. I sent you two emails during the break. The first, and we're going to go over the first one in just a bit. But the first one has the set of array exercises I want you to try, and it also has your first assignment. Again, before the end of the period, I'll go over both of those. The second email that I sent you has got 6 URLs on it. All right. I had a whole big presentation prepared, which now I can't find. So I'm just going to wing it and it'll be fine. This is Dennis. I don't know how you pronounce it, if that's Listiati or Istiati, but he's got a 6-part thing in here on an introduction and basics of JavaScript. We're going to go over some of this now. I will mention to you, and I think I've said this to you before, but I pay $5 a month and I get stuff from a site that's called medium.com. All right, you go out to medium.com. So I've been a subscriber for about a year. Now, you might say, well, why are you going down here? Why don't you show us the top? Because typically they don't do this, but they've got an article in here that's got a word in here we're not supposed to be saying in class. All right. But there's a lot of really good stuff in here. All right. Some of the examples that we're going to go through in class, I've either used these as as an incentive, or maybe even grabbed it and started making my own changes to it. All right, it's $5 a month. I'm not trying to sell you or make you do anything, but just in case you're interested. All right, so this is a 6-part series on the basics of JavaScript. I don't want to waste your time talking about things like history. I'm not saying that history is boring and history is bad, but when it comes to talking about programming languages, it's not that important. You have heard me give the shtick before that the governing body for JavaScript is ECMA. ECMA is the European Computer Manufacturing Association. So the governing body for JavaScript is not the W3C, like it pretty much is for HTML and for CSS. It's ECMA. In fact, the original name of JavaScript was ECMAScript. All right. A lot of people think they shouldn't have changed the name. Notice it is now going on about 30 years old. The big change in this class, and you've heard this already, is we're going to be learning to write JavaScript on the server. All right. So again, they give you some history, then they talk about JavaScript on the server, and they'll even get into in here, they will talk about a little bit about Node in here. Okay. All right. Now, as far as development tools, I'm going to expect when we're doing something together, I'm going to expect that you're going to be using Chrome as your browser and Visual Studio Code as your editor of choice. That doesn't mean if you've got an editor you like better, you can't use it. But if I do something, I might say, and here you might want to grab this extension. If you're using Atom or Sublime Text or something else, I won't know how to get those extensions. That's what I'm telling you. All right. Okay. Now, I've said this kind of thing to you before, but I want to say it again. I'm trying to be complete here and kind of wrap up the old JavaScript basically on the client and start getting into JavaScript on the server. And that is, it used to be that this is what you would find all the time in here. You would find body, and then right at the bottom of the body, you would put in your script tags, and you would either add your JavaScript right there, or you would add it in as an external file. All right. You can still do it that way. You will see it done that way in many, many, many websites today. But what's becoming even more standard is rather than putting your script tag like this, rather than putting it in the body, it's gone back up to where it's in the head section. But the key thing is when you say this, either after the word script and before source or after the source, you put the word in there defer, D-E-F-E-R. Because when you put in the word defer, it all has to do with how fast, what is loaded when. HTML before CSS, before JavaScript, etc. And by putting the defer attribute in there, all right, by adding that to your script tag, you're basically letting the system know that you should not bring this JavaScript in and be able to start using it until everything else basically has loaded. All right. Some of the things that are going to change in what we're doing. When you get into server-side JavaScript, you almost never see a semicolon at the end of a line. Now, that's very counterintuitive to the way that I try to bring it across to you on client-side JavaScript. All right, where you really should be basically doing it all over the place. And I do want to mention too, not to confuse you, but just so you know, in this class, there are going to be times, almost the entire class, we're going to be working solely with server-side JavaScript. But there may be occasions where we have to use client-side JavaScript as well. So you might have 2 JavaScript files, but they'll be in different locations. What we'll eventually get to is when we start creating bigger projects, you will have a folder called backend that'll have your server-side stuff, and you'll have a folder called front end that'll have all your client-side stuff. that makes no sense to you, just hold on because we'll get there eventually. Okay. All right. You know about comments already. Same as we had heard in C# and whatever. Single line comments, slash, multi-line comments. Start with a slash star, end with a star slash. Nothing big there. All right. Data types. JavaScript has only one number type. All right. Everything is considered of type number. That said, as you know, you can still do a parse int or you can still do a parse float. All right. So even though you can treat it as though there are two different types of variables, technically there is only one number type in all of JavaScript. Boolean, we know what Boolean is. It's true, false. String type, you know this, that it can be either double quotes or single quotes. What I'm going to ask is when you start using those, all right, I'm going to recommend at certain times, I'm going to recommend that you use double quotes, and at other times, I'll say it's really not going to matter. And if you say, well, what does that mean? You'll have to wait until we get into some of these. What I hope to be able to do tomorrow, all right, just so you know, what I hope to do, and I've been working on this, I've got to finish it up, is we will create a few applications as a class. There'll be smaller applications, but I want us to do some stuff where we're using some APIs, some application program interfaces. So we'll be calling out to external APIs. Even though we're doing it on the client side, I want you to get used to API calls before we go and bring it over to the server side. Then between on Thursday and Friday will both end up being lab days. But on Friday, some of the stuff that I'm asking you to do for homework, I'm going to do it in front of you on Friday. All right. Okay. Hopefully that made at least a little bit of sense. Escape sequences, typically the ones you have to worry about are \n and \t. All right. Variables. Bottom line is don't use var anymore. Don't use var ever. And I don't even care because you can read this or other places and they'll say, at times you want to use var for create. No, you don't. I'm expecting you will never use var. All right. You will use let. And what you're going to find out, and again, it's a little counterintuitive from some of the stuff that you have learned in the past, that we're going to use const, C-O-N-S-T, probably approximately, I don't know, but I'd say approximately 85 to 90% of the time. We're hardly ever going to use let. We're going to use const for just about everything. All right. You know that JavaScript is unique when you change the value in the variable, in a regular variable, like with a let, that since it's not a type specific language, it can have a number and then later you can give it a Boolean and later you can give it a string, etc. That's nothing new. All right. So there's a thing in here on let and const. Okay. And as it says, JavaScript is no longer recommended to use the var keyword to create variables. Replace it with let. The big difference between let and const is let is what's called block scoped. What that means is let is going to be known in between whatever curly braces in which it's been defined. It's considered a much cleaner way of declaring variables. All right. Const, and they have a little bit about it in here, and they say, while the const keyword is different, when a variable has been filled with a const, the value cannot be changed anymore. That's not true. All right. You're going to see that typically the value cannot be changed. But as an example, if I create an array, in this example, we would get an error doing this. All right. In that example. But if we create an array and we put in 3 strings, and then later on in the array, we change those 3 strings to 3 other strings, you can do that with a const. All right. So really, when you're talking about you can't change the values with a const, that's typically primitive or simplistic values, elementary data types. All right. Our mathematical operations, you know all these. I'm guessing at least, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have to go over any of these. As of 2016, you can use either math.pow for using exponents, or you can use the double the double asterisk. All right. And basically, in my opinion, at least, they stole that from Visual Basic, because you could do that in Visual Basic since forever. All right. And they give some examples. You know this, that you can use the plus equals, the minus equals, times equals, exponentiation equals, divide equals, and modulo equals. You should by now be comfortable and have a comfort level with each and every one of those. All right. You should also know plus, plus, and minus, minus to add one or remove one. Okay. And be comfortable using those. All right. The comparison operators, I will tell you, when you look at enough code, you're almost never seeing the double equal sign. Almost everything that's done today is done using the triple equal sign. And remember, the difference between the double equal sign and the triple equal sign is with the double equal sign. If you were to compare the number 63 with the string in double quotes 63 in double quotes, if you did the double equals, it would say that they're equal. With a triple quotes, not only does it check the equality, but it checks the type. So it would say false. All right. The logical operators, by now you should be familiar with this. You should also be familiar with the fact, and I know we've talked about this before, that when you do this, when you do the double ampersand, all right, that what happens is if it's an and condition, if it finds the first one is false, it doesn't check the second one, because there's no sense in doing it. If you got an or condition, if the first one is true, it never checks the second one. All right. And if you wanted to check both regardless, you can use just a single ampersand or a single pipe sign. Not is known as the inverter. These are truth tables. All right. And I will tell you, so that's an and truth table. You notice the only time it's true is when both sides of the and are true. Otherwise, it's false. With or, it's pretty much the opposite. It's true unless both sides are false. And not is the inverter. It takes true and returns it to false, takes false and turns it to true. Give you a very quick little story that you probably could care less about, but back when I was going for my master's degree, I decided to take a couple classes in architecture. The first computer architecture class that I took, they literally gave us one of these old Heathkit things. I had to wire together and gates, or gates, and not gates. You had to wire them together and then run a tester on it. And if it came up red, you did something wrong. If it came up green, you did it right. All right. So internally, that's what's happening. All right. It's got to be like 1 and 1 is true. 1 and 0 is false. 0 and 1 is false. 0 and 0 is false, etc. That's literally what's happening when you're doing these checks with ands and ors. All right. So that's the end of part 1. I'm just going to go on. If anybody has any questions, comments, or whatever, shoot them. And if you don't, fine. Again, what I am trying to do here is I'm trying to be complete. I'm trying to kind of put a wrapping and a bow around the JavaScript that we have done previously so we can get into the new JavaScript. All right. So what's going to happen, and I want to actually show you something right now. All right. And that is, so I'm going to have to change my share for just a second. But you're used to, let's see, how am I going to do this? In fact, I can probably do it here. You're used to, if I go over to inspect, all right, and I don't know what's in here, I could care less. But if I go to console, see, there's a bunch of warnings and stuff in here. But if I go to console and type in here, I think it's console.clear. No, it's not. Clear isn't working, so. All right. But if I come in and type in this, 2 plus 2 and hit enter. It gives me 4. Why should you care? What I want you to understand is when you go into the inspect mode inside of your developer tools and you go to the console tab, when you do all that stuff, you are working with client-side JavaScript. We will be working with a different console that we will be using when we are working with server-side JavaScript. All right. And hopefully already by next week, you're going to be seeing that in action. All right. So there's a lot of ways that you can do console. We're used to just console, .log, to be honest with you, but there's other ones you can use. If you use warning, I think it comes up in a yellow or a cyan color. Error should print the stuff in red. You can do a console.table. And if you do that, you can print out information and it automatically will put it into a tabular format for you. All right. Now, this may not look like a big thing, but I'm showing you something in here now because it's going to become unbelievably important. When you use backticks, like the ones that are shown right here, you typically, not in this example, but you typically use backticks like that with template literals. You're going to see an example of those either in here or in one of the later uh, articles. All right. But the key takeaway, though, is when you have template literals like this, you can put it over multiple lines. And you might say, well, who cares? Those multiple lines could literally, if you wanted to do it, you wouldn't write it like this, but you could write inside of in between these backticks, you could write a whole HTML page in there if you wanted to. All right. And then that would assign that entire HTML page to a variable. Again, that's not typically the way we're going to use it, but you'll see some semblance of this that we're going to actually use the backticks and write on multiple lines. But again, the majority of the work that we're going to be using with backticks will be with template literals. All right. Let's see. You should know by now when you start looking at this stuff that when you do something like this, if you attempt to combine together a string and a number, they'll concatenate. So that's not going to give you right here. It's not going to give you 3. It's going to give you the string 1, 2. But if you want to have that happen, you can cast this as type number. All right. And I think they're going to show that in here. All right. If not here, they'll show it later. There it is with number. All right. And by now, you should be familiar with parse int. You should be familiar with parse float. You should be familiar with NaN, not a number, and how that's used. That's typically not going to be as important in here. But again, there are times when if you are asking a person for input and you are expecting, let's assume for a second, you're asking them to input an age. All right, so you ask them to input an age and they leave it blank or they put in something with a non-numeric value in it. You have to be able to handle those cases where you get NaN. Part of that is using the isNaN function. Nothing new there. All right, arrays. You already saw a little bit of stuff on arrays so far. This will be a little bit more, and there'll be more in other articles in this thing, the other 4 that we're going to go through next. All right, arrays are collections. Again, an array in JavaScript is dynamic. Notice what this paragraph says. This is one of the things that differentiates JavaScript from most other programming languages. The only other language that I know, and I probably know a half dozen or so, but the only other programming language that I know that has dynamic arrays is PHP. All right. So as it says, data can be added automatically when we enter the data into the array. The real bottom line on that, and I think I've mentioned this to you, so sorry if you've heard it once or twice or 10 times before, is arrays in JavaScript are considered to be late binded. What that means is the array, the size of it, etc., is figured out at runtime. That's since it's at runtime, that's why it's dynamic. That's why it can change. All right. And you can make arrays bigger and smaller. On the other hand, with a language like C# or a language like Java, they are what are referred to as early binded. So in other words, the size of the array is set at compile time and it cannot change. So you cannot take a C# array or a Java array and make it bigger as the program's running. Okay. Do arrays work? Yes. All right. Here's adding things to an array. So we talked about these things already. I'm not going to read those to you. You should understand push. You should understand pop, which is the opposite. And remember, push and pop, either push something to the end of the array or remove something from the end of the array. Shift and unshift, add something to the beginning of the array or remove something from the beginning of the array. All right, nothing new in there. Again, that should all make sense to you. One of the things that JavaScript does, again, as it says, is it allows you to have associative arrays. What does that mean? That means that the indexes for an array in JavaScript do not have to be numbers. So for instance, and this is the example I've given before, if we had a list of states, and let's just say we had 3 states, let's say Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. I could make, if we were doing them in alphabetic order, I could make states 0, Illinois, states 1, Missouri, states 2, Wisconsin. That would be fine. But rather than using those numbers, I can actually use string values. So the string value or the index value for Wisconsin, I might make the string WI, for Missouri MO, and for Illinois IL, etc. All right. All right. Sooner or later in this class, we will be either working with or probably at least touching upon the object data type. Now, the good news is that starting in around 2015, there were changes that were made to the JavaScript programming language where you can literally set up objects and classes in JavaScript in a way very similar to the way you do it in C# or in Java. Before that, you had to use something called prototypes. They were ugly as hell. They were confusing as hell. You can still use those. Many people still do. But like I said, with the advent of ES5 and ES6, you can now write, when you are working with objects and object-oriented programming, you can write JavaScript that looks much more like the stuff that we have done in earlier classes. All right. I don't think we have to talk about if or else. You know what all that is, and else if. All right. Now, for some reason, I think that this guy, I don't know if he's dyslexic, if he's got whatever, but almost all the time when you use the word and, he puts Dan in there, which I find funny because I'm weird. All right. You should understand alerts already. You should understand prompts already. Are we going to use those in our program? Virtually never. All right. I don't think I've ever seen an application program that had an alert in it. I really don't. All right. I guess there you might be able to come up with your own example of where that might make sense, but off the top of my head, I couldn't think of it. All right. And the prompt, typically you're not going to be soliciting input from a user using a prompt. You'll be doing it using a form or something more along those lines. All right. Okay. Finally, the confirm. That one actually is important, not probably with what we're doing, but at least that you've seen it. So there is an alert. You've all seen those. Welcome to the website. There's a prompt. What is your name? You've seen that. You may or may not have seen the confirm, because the confirm is like a prompt, but when you use confirm, you can either click OK or you can click cancel. And if you click cancel, what do? Whatever it is you want to do. And if you click OK, it's again, whatever it is you want to do. All right. Undefined. If you create a variable right here, like this example, let name, if I tried to print that out, so if I literally went in there and did a console.log and I put name in there, it would literally come back as undefined. And as it says, a variable that has not been added a value comes back as undefined. All right. It's not the same thing as null. All right. Null means unknown. All right. Technically, you are defining something, but you're defining it as being unknown. All right. A little confusing with the terminology, but that's what it is. It says it's different from undefined. It means the variable has been added its value, but the value that was added is null. And I realize that's confusing. The good news is if you're working with objects and the like, and you've got this big, maybe a big array of objects, and now you just basically want to clear everything out of it, one way to do that is to set it to null. There's other ways as well. All right, so that's the second one. So I'm jumping right into number 3. Like I said, this period isn't going the way I planned it, but it'll be fine. All right, I'm assuming you understand how to use the switch. All right, in fact, one of the first examples we're going to look at when we start doing a little bit of very simplistic routing right inside of our index.js file is we'll use the switch. All right, so I'm assuming that you can look at that and that makes sense to you. What we will do is in here, we will be checking here is what route do you want to go by? So if it was a slash, we might want to go to a home page. If it was a slash about, we might want to go to an about page. A slash contact, we might want to go to a contact page. And if it was anything else, we might want to go to a 404 error page, file not found, something like that. All right. Type of, as it says, type of is an operator. It says we can use to see the data type of a value or of a variable. All right, it says sometimes we need to check if something is of a certain data type before we do something with it. Maybe you want to make sure that something is Boolean before you check whether or not it's true or false. Maybe you want to check to see whether or not something actually is a number, okay, before you do an operation on it, etc. The one thing I'm not going to go over is this symbol. This is a new data type that is about 4 or 5 years old. We should not have any reason to use that in here. But if you're interested, there's some good ratings on it, especially on the dev.mozilla.org site. All right. And this last thing that's in here, I don't even know. Lanya, I've never used that, so I'm not going to even go over that. The in operator, as it says, can be used to check whether a property is in an object or not. So in other words, does person contain a property called first name? So that's going to return true in this case, but it could also return false, depending. It says in operator will only check whether the property exists or not. So even if it's in there, but they've both been set to null, it'll still return true because there is that property, even if it doesn't have a value. So it's checking for the existence of something, not what it has inside of it. Ternary, you should be familiar with the question mark colon operator. This, they give an example here. It's a little small, so let me make it bigger. All right. So you're going to check to see if whatever this is greater than 75. Well, it's not. So since it's not greater than 75, we skip what comes after the question mark, which is the true, and we do what comes after the colon, which is the false. So in this case, for an Nelia or whatever it is, it would say, try again, you failed the exam. If we change this from greater than sign to a greater than or equal to, it would come back and say, congratulations, you passed the exam. All right. Some of this stuff, we're not going to use it, but it's interesting that you at least are exposed to it. This first thing is the nullish coalescing operator. All right. It says it's an operator similar to ternary, but the difference is if the value is null, you can give it a default. All right. So this is doing it without that. And then they come back and do it like this. So what this is saying is if data is set, all right, you will take parameter, and that's what will be assigned to data. If it's not, you will take whatever that default is and you'll assign it to data. All right. So again, it's in some ways, it's kind of like what we learned in JavaScript where you could have default function arguments, but it's rather than a function argument, it's something right inside of the regular code itself. Chaining, you're going to be doing a lot of chaining. All right. Chaining kind of, for lack of better words, became really popular with jQuery. But here's console.info. So what are we asking? Well, probably what this is, just taking a look at it, is we have an object called person. Inside of that object called person, there is another object inside of there that is called address. Inside of that address, there is another object in there that's called country. We're going to be using it not so much like this. We're going to be using it more the jQuery way, where we're going to say do something, and then on the next line we'll say dot then do something else, dot then do something else. All right, so you're going to see this again and again. All right. Falsy and truthy. Basically, falsy is all the stuff that's shown here. And don't ask me how they came up with falsy and truthy. Somebody did. What that says is if the Boolean value is always considered false, 0 and -0 are always considered false. The empty string, whether it's double quotes, single quotes, or a backticks, they're considered false. Null is considered false. Undefined is considered false. NaN is considered false. Why did I read all those to you? Because everything else is considered true. You remember that when we started in, I don't know if it was JavaScript or C++ or C# rather, but we'd say something like if flag equal true. And I said, you don't even need to write all that. You can just say if flag. Because again, if it's truthy, if it's not one of these, it's true. And that's what they're saying in here. All right. Again, we've already talked about logical and logical or. You should understand those. All right. So nothing more really in there. They talk about different ways you can use them. The for loop should be, you should have a comfort level with that by now. All right. We're going to probably end up using for in and for of and for each more often than for, but virtually anything to my knowledge that you can do with for of and for each and for in, you can almost always do the same thing with a for loop. The for loop's been around forever. The reason a lot of people like to use the for loop in lieu of some of the other loops is that they know that you can use that across different languages. They're just used to using it. This is right here, that would be an infinite loop. All right, because there's no initial condition, there's no test, and there's no resetting the loop control variable. So if you put this into something and you put in, they ran it, that alert would come up. As soon as you closed it, it would run again. And you closed it and it would run again. All right. Looping with init. Yeah, this is typically how you see a for loop set up. You should by now be more than comfortable with a while loop. And again, the big difference is with a for loop, it's all on one line. With a while loop, it's on multiple lines. But just like a for loop, a while loop is a pretest loop, meaning that if this is false initially, so if that had been 11 right here on this first line, you'd never go into the loop body. In the same way, if that had been 11, you'd never go into the loop body here. Most people like the for loop when you can use it. It's a counting loop, so you need to know how many iterations exactly you're going through. But if you are working on a while loop, you don't necessarily have to know how many iterations you're going through. All right. Part 4 of 6 here, the do while loop. Typically, the only reason that you will use a do while loop is when you are testing error code, because by putting it into a do while, you can force that code in there to be run. What most developers do is something along those lines. All right. And then what they end up doing is then they revert this back to a regular while loop. Again, I'm assuming by now that you understand break and you understand continue, how they work, why you use them, how you use them, etc. I don't think there's any sense in going over those. If you disagree, you can look at the examples here. So if we look here, if counter is greater than 10 break, that would break us out. All right. Here, if we do a continue, notice we're going from 1 to 10, but we're saying if the number is even, in other words, if it's evenly divisible by 2, and they should have used a triple equal there, continue, so that's only going to print out the odd numbers. What you may or may not know of is when you write loops, all right, you can have labels associated with them. All right. Now, this is something that's fairly unique to JavaScript and a few other languages, but that said, I don't think you should do this. I personally think there's always a better way of writing it than using using labels like this. In other languages that I used to teach, in older languages like Visual Basic before visualbasic.net, you did a lot of work where you use labels. And it resulted in a lot of spaghetti-ish code where it was very hard, at least on occasion, to see this, to see that, to do this, to do that, just the way that it worked. All right. For in, as it says, it's a for loop used to iterate over all the data properties in the object or index of an array. All right. It's a shortcut. Everything that they're doing in here, you could have done in a standard for loop, but you don't have to worry about, basically in here, you're doing the initialization and you're telling it while there's still stuff, go through it. Most people will tell you this is much cleaner than a regular for loop. You don't have to worry about things like length. You don't have to worry about a plus plus or a minus minus. It just does it. All right. There is a for of loop, and as it says, the for in is used to iterate over a property or an index. For of is used to iterate over the contents of an iterable object. And it says array strings and others. All right, you can do it on regular objects, you can do it in JSON, you can do for of in a lot of different places. So they give you an example here. Again, I mentioned this earlier. This is why you typically would take your array name and make it pluralized. So when you are checking it in your for of, you can use the singular version. All right, this is a kind of a silly example. The other thing that this particular example right here shows that is at least of a little bit of importance is, again, template literals right there. The backticks and using the $sign. I'm going to assume that we are going to, anytime that we're going to console log or print out anything, even if we're not printing out a variable, we're going to use backticks. Why? Because we could at least conceivably have template literals in there. All right, so there's using it in an array, there's using it in a string. The with statement, which I very rarely, if any time, use, as it says, it's used to derive a data scope. By using the with, you can access property, it says, in data without having to mention the data. So instead of doing it like this, you can do it like this. All right. You might look at that and go, what does that buy you? What you are doing with the with statement is you are compartmentalizing. You are saying that this thing is kind of a block, for lack of better words. The example they give is not really a good one. And notice it even says, Most people don't recommend using the with statement because sometimes it can make code ambiguous, and they give you an example of that. All right, now we start to get into the good stuff. Okay, functions. When we start to write this stuff and you start writing functions, there are different ways that you can write functions. All right, this is a named function right here. A named function is designed to be called more than once in a program. If you've got a function that you write that you can be 100% certain it's going to be a one and done, you're going to call it one time and you will never, ever call it again, you typically don't use this. You typically write an anonymous function, which means the function doesn't have a name. All right. You can also write what's called an IFE, which you may or may not have heard of. What is it? IFFE. It's immediately something, it can be immediately invoked. All right. It's what it is you write an anonymous function, so an unnamed one, and then you call it right after you declare it, rather than calling it on another line. All right. You should know by now and be comfortable with what parameters are. You should also be comfortable with the fact that when you set up parameters, like in the example here, with a first name and a last name, that it's totally legitimate for you to give one or both of those default values. All right. Functions can return things. You may or may not have ever noticed this. If I go in here and I go back to inspect, like I showed you before, and I go back to console here, and I come in here and I type in, I don't know, let's try, I don't know if this will work or not, alert hello. Right? It gives me that, but when I click the OK button, it comes back, and you may or may not be able to see that, with the word undefined. And basically, I am making a call to a function. To what function? To the alert function. What's it returning? It's not returning anything. Since it's not returning anything, the return type is considered to be undefined. All right. I already mentioned optional parameters to you. All right. And these are not great examples. All right, but I gave you an example that I think is better than that just a minute ago. Let's finish these up, and then we will take our next break. All right, so where are we here? I don't want that. I want this. All right, this is getting in. The last couple things in here are some of the more complex parts of this, okay? All right, we've already mentioned again the default parameter, setting it up like this. There's nothing new there. But now, if you haven't been listening that much so far, please listen between now and about 2 o'clock or so, because this is stuff you have to be able to understand. The first is a REST parameter. All right, it says REST is a feature where we can send as much data as possible in one parameter, and it will be converted into an array. Who cares? You should. Because when you've got a REST parameter like this, let's forget about the word name there. Suppose you just had ... data, and data was an array. All right. You could call it down here, and you could pass it 1 thing, 2 things, 10 things, 100 things. Because by putting that in there, by putting in that REST parameter, what you're saying is, I want this to be able to be a variable number. So I can have a variable number of parameters I'm actually passing. That's what you do with the REST parameter, which is used typically in accordance with the spread syntax. All right. It says sometimes we already have data in the form of an array. We can also pass an array to a REST parameter. So there it is, where you're not passing it necessarily an array. There it is, but you are passing it an array. All right. The big thing is, when you are working with this stuff, what REST and spread allow you to do is they allow you to work with a variable number of elements. The reason that that's important is if you were calling, this is going to allow you to do something on every element there is. All right. So imagine that I had a bunch of different lists, and for each one of these lists, I wanted the maximum value and the minimum value and the average. But each one of the lists was maybe an array, and each array had a different number of elements in it. That's where this would come in handy. All right. Arguments object, it says before there was a rest parameter, there was already something called arguments, not used much anymore. So I'm not even going to talk about it. All right. Functions as values. All right. Again, one of the things about using a language like JavaScript that differentiates it from most other languages, what are we doing here? We're taking a function and assigning it to a variable. All right. So this right here is the same thing as making that function call. And you might look at that and say, in that example, what is that buying you? And I would say in this example, very little. All right. But this becomes more and more important as you start doing things of greater and greater complexity. All right. So as it says, functions can not only be used as executable program code, they can also be used as values. So again, a function in JavaScript can be used like a variable. That's the key thing. You can also pass a function into a function. All right. So you pass it as a parameter. All right. I would strongly suggest that you read this. I will go over it, but at first blush, it may or may not make sense. It says, continuing with the code example above, we use the say hello function as a parameter to the give me name. So say hello is referred to in here as callback. All right, see that? All right. What's the reason that callback and stuff is going to be important, and we're going to start looking at it soon, is the way that Node works, the way that Node.js works with JavaScript on the server. You can only do one thing at a time. All right. But sometimes I might go out and I might tell the system, hey, go out to this database, then find this table, then query these 10 billion records, and then join that table with another table, and then get me everything that meets this criteria. As you'd probably guess, something like that typically will not come back in like that in less than a second. So what happens when you start using these and these callbacks is you end up being able to say, okay, I'm going to put this in a special part of memory, go on and keep going. When it finishes, then I can go and work on it. All right. And if that didn't make sense to you, hopefully it'll start making sense to you when we start using them. All right. An anonymous function is a function without a name. All right. That's the big thing. Again, an anonymous function is one that typically is designed to be called only once. Okay. All right. Again, mentioned this earlier. This again is one of the few languages that I know that allow you to do this, that almost encourage it. And that is, you can have functions embedded inside of functions. The other thing too is that this is not a good example to show you. Anything that you define up here in outer, anything that gets defined up here in outer, all right, is available inside of inner here. All right. So it says the contain function is called the inner function. It can only be accessed inside of this function. So you can't call inner technically directly, but you can call it from outer. All right. Scope goes back to that whole idea of when we talked about var and we talked about let. var has what's known as global scope. It sometimes is called window scope. All right. Let has block scope. In other words, it's where you define it, it's between those curly braces. Let is again considered the cleaner way of doing it today. Recursive functions. A recursive function is a function that calls itself. All right. And the key thing about recursion is you've got to give yourself a way to have it stop calling itself. Recursion, when used correctly, can result in much faster code. When you use recursion and you're calling a thing is calling itself too many times, it literally slows your code down to where it'll stop executing. All right. So for right here with this factorial program, this works fine. So if you don't know what a factorial is, for example, if I said, what is 6 factorial? 6 factorial is 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So in other words, 6 factorial is 6 times 5 factorial. And 5 factorial is 5 times 4 factorial, etc. That'll work fine for a factorial program unless you put in a really huge number like 1,000,000, where it'll try to do 1,000,000 times 999,999, etc. That can take your program and literally grind it to a halt. Function generators, I haven't used these too much, but as it says here, it's used to create a data generator. So you create a function that you're going to use to create your inputs that you're able to use in other functions. I think there's other ways of doing it. Lazy evaluation. All right, just so you hear this, as it says, generators are lazy. With lazy evaluation, what you're doing is, for lack of better words, you're kind of telling the system to do this as you get the time to do it. Don't slow down what we're working on just to be able to do something. All right. This next thing in here, this is probably the most, if you listen to nothing else I've said for these last 2 days, understand arrow functions because you're going to be writing hundreds of them. All right. The arrow function is a newer alternative to writing functions. So in this function right here, okay, we could have put in here the word function and then in parentheses name and gotten rid of this thing, and it would have looked exactly the same. What arrow functions allow you to do is they take your code and they can basically minimize your code. In this example, writing this the way they did, as opposed to putting the word function here and getting rid of that arrow, it didn't buy you much, a few keystrokes. But if you've got a function that's just returning a line of code, you can write it like this. So this says what? This says it's an arrow function. It's got one parameter in it that's called name, and it's going to return this console.info that says hello, followed by that name. And it'll be Dennis in this case. So you don't have to write an entire block of code if there's just a return statement in it. What we'll be writing a lot will be arrow functions. And with these arrow functions, we're going to have in these parentheses here, REQ for request. That'll be your hypertext transfer protocol request, followed by a comma, followed by RES, which will be your hypertext transfer protocol response. All right. The other thing, just so you know, because you'll see it, if there's only one parameter here, like we have name, you don't need parentheses. If there are 0 parameters, you need parentheses. If there's more than one parameter, you need parentheses. If there's only one like this, the parentheses then are optional. All right. And I mean, I would take a look at this. I don't want to go into it too much because I don't want to confuse anybody. There is a portion in your textbook from last semester or 2 semesters ago, depending on when you took it, from the AWD1111 class. There should be a thing in there that goes through arrow functions probably better than I just did. I gave you some of the basics, and that's what's important that you start to understand. All right. The last thing that's in here are closures. All right. And it says with closures, you can create a function in the local scope and reference the data around it in a local scope. Again, what does that mean? That means it's kind of what I told you before. It means this inner function right here that's called add has access to the word owner, even though it's defined outside of the function itself. As long as it's defined inside of the function that contains the inner function or the outer function, you can use it. All right. That leaves us with one more, part 6, but it is just about 2 o'clock. So we're going to take our next break. Let's please come back then at, let's make it 2:10. That'll give you 12 or 13 minutes. We'll pick it up right there. All right, I'm going to continue on. Hopefully you're back. I'm going to go over this last part that's right here, which is part 6. Between the arrow functions and this part, these are the two parts of this series of documents or articles that are the most relevant to the class that you're in right now. All right. And again, it's not important that you memorize anything. Part of being a good developer is to know where to go to look for something. Google is your friend, yeah, but sometimes it's more than Google. I will tell you, you've gotten to the point with where the stuff that you are working with in this class and the stuff that you will be working with, those of you who will be continuing on, who are not graduating in December and will continue on in the spring, Stack Overflow. So if you Google something and something that's in there comes back to Stack Overflow, that's typically what you're going to want to look at, because if it's a development question, those are all developers. All right. So with that said, let's go through this. They talk about the object method here, and they show you some stuff in here. Now, when you look at this, it says functions and objects are sometimes referred to as the object method. So you might look at that right there and go, wait a minute, you said that this is going to look pretty much like it did in C# or like it did in Java. This is one way of doing this. Again, I'm not saying it's the only way, but what they've done here is they're creating a variable called person. All right. It's got a name property in it called Dennis, and it also has a say hello function in it. So from outside of there, you can say person dot say hello. And as it says, it will then it will say hello, Dennis. But if you call it with something else, it will, basically Dennis is going to be the name. But if you give it another name, all right, it's just going to call it with that name. Now, why should you care? We're not going to be doing all that much directly with objects, but it is imperative, it's important that you have an understanding of objects, regardless of what language you're using. I would tell you that if you go on an interview and you go on an interview for a JavaScript developer and they ask you to write some code, there's at least a fairly good chance it'll be something that's object oriented. All right. It may not be anything that's related to MERN stack, etc., the stuff we've been doing, but you should understand it. Same thing in Java, same thing in C#. All right. One of the most misunderstood things in this language, in the JavaScript language, is the word this. Sometimes you need to use it, sometimes you have to use it, sometimes you can't use it, etc. And what does it mean? Typically, this refers to whatever is currently executing. Now, I'm not saying does that make sense to you, because it may make no sense to you. All right. But usually when you are inside of a method, this refers to what's happening in that method. If you refer to this outside of the method, all right, it's not local to the method, but it's in the object. If you refer to this outside of that, it usually is the window object. And if you say that made no sense, that's the way it was explained to me. And I'm not saying that's a great explanation, but there are going to be times in here where we will use the this variable. All right. A little bit more in here on arrow functions. All right. And we've talked about this. A lot of this is almost repetition from what you've seen before. This looks more like what we talked about in C# and what we talked about in Java, etc. Because notice getters and setters. Getters, which are also known as accessors, allow you to return something. Setters, which are also known as mutators, allow you to change something. So you can create getters and setters when you are doing object-oriented JavaScript. Again, it's not that you have to. It's another thing that is available to you. All right, that's what I'm trying to get across. In this case, you'll notice there's a getter and there's no setter. In other words, first name and last name in this case are read-only. Although it doesn't happen often, you can have a setter without a getter where something is write-only. All right. And that might mean that you passed in a variable that doesn't have a value, and you give it a value inside of the method itself. That's when you would probably use a write only or a setter without a getter. Most often, though, you're going to use them both. And I do realize this is not identical. This is not identical to the way you do it in C#, which is not identical to the way you do it in Java. Every language has their own nuances, but the idea of using a get and a set is similar between all three of the languages. All right. What's wrong with var? All right. Says var is not recommended anymore because it doesn't have block scope. You can do a lot of things with var that you shouldn't do. What do I mean? Well, imagine that we basically defined a variable inside of a method. So we define a variable in a method and we use the word var with it. All right. What happens is that variable is automatically global and it's available everywhere. A lot of developers like that and like doing that. Personally, I think it's more or less, it's a hack and it's something that should never be done. All right. As it says, the use of var can result in code that can be unpredictable. And they show an example of using let versus using var and what can happen. All right. The next thing that's in there, again, this is stuff you're just being introduced to right now. So again, we are on the way moving from client-side JavaScript to server-side JavaScript. All right. And as it says, destructuring is something that you can use to disassemble something, to destructure it, to break it apart. All right. And what you can do is, for example, here, this is destructuring. What are we doing? We are taking this, which is a variable, an array, a string array with 3 parts, and we are breaking it into individual components. And you might say, well, yeah, we can always do that. But notice up here, we don't have anything called first name, middle name, and last name. We're creating them right here. And we're ripping out these 3 values and putting them into these 3 variables and then assigning them, all right, I should say into these 3 new variables. That can be really important because you can destructure a lot of things, including objects. All right. So they're saying in here, retrieving the data. So they destructure it and then they bring it back together again. So it says retrieving. It says retrieving data in object. It says if we destructure, it becomes a little bit different. I don't want to get into it in too much depth right now because it's really confusing. I tried doing this in earlier classes, and afterwards I talked to a couple people afterwards. I said, does that make sense? They were like, not really at all. No. So I think when you see it in action, it'll make more sense, is what I'm telling you. All right. Here's an example too. When you look at it, when you create an array goes within brackets. Right? Brackets. These are objects. How do I know that? They're within curly braces. And within this person object, we have another object. Totally legit to do that. And again, you can destructure with that as well. All right. Default values we've talked about. I don't want to get into that. Strict mode is a kind of an important thing in here. It says when we run a JavaScript program by default, the code runs in non-strict code. In other words, by default, unless told otherwise, you're allowed to be about as sloppy as you want to be. Starting in ECMA 5, which was in about 2015, strict mode was introduced. So you can say using strict at the top of your program, or use strict, I think it is, at the top of your program. And if you do, what's going to happen is a lot of the ambiguity that JavaScript allows, you won't be able to use anymore. All right. And that, like I said, that becomes really, really important. All right. So you turn it on with the use strict. Okay. Will we be using it? There'll be times you won't want to use it. And we'll talk about that later. Finally, I think the last thing that's explained in here is they talk debugger. And as it says, it's used to perform the debugging process. You know what debugging is. All right. With the debugger, you can stop the program code at the position or breakpoint that you put in. So basically, you are manually putting a breakpoint in there. The difference is you're putting that breakpoint right in your code as opposed to going into an IDE like Visual Studio and setting a breakpoint there. All right. And that's it. Now, there's other articles. I found a couple more as we were going through this. I'm not going to go through these, but here's one. For instance, some useful array methods in JavaScript. And basically, we've talked about almost all of these. We didn't talk about flat or flat map, which we won't have to use anyway. But there's examples. And there was another one here that was called arrays in JavaScript. After a while, you know, when you read and you read and you read, it's almost like you're reading the same thing. I'm going to come and on Friday, I'll give you another URL or two, which I consider to probably be better than these. But you can go out all over the place. For instance, notice it says here more from Medium. There's a JavaScript 101 series. Is it any good? I don't know. I've never read it. The problem with all this stuff is there is so much to take a look at that you can spend all your time reading and you're not spending much time learning. So I wanted to go through and give you basically talk to you about what this stuff is and what it's about. All right, and give you some review of the client side JavaScript and an intro into the server side JavaScript. All right, and that was my goal here. I wanted to do that because some of the code that we will end up writing, even though we're going to go first just into almost straight MySQL and almost straight MongoDB, there's at least a chance and a fairly good chance when we start doing this that we are going to be writing some JavaScript. All right, in fact, almost a certainty. Okay, so what I sent to you during the break, I'm going to show it to you right now. So I got to change here. I'm going to change my share. So give me a second. One of them you've already seen, but we're going to go over it again anyway. So let's see. And that is this. I do want you to go in and create yourself some kind of a website. I showed you my copy and I took some screenshots here of it. It doesn't have to look at all like mine. I don't care. All right. But it should have a home page. It should have an about page. You don't need an FAQ page unless you want to do that, or you can make your about page an FAQ page, whatever. But it should have a BMI page and it should have a contact page. All right. I will tell you that what I want you to be doing between now and when this is due on Sunday by midnight is to create this. What I am going to do, amongst other things, what I am going to do with you on Friday is I'm going to show you how I wrote the BMI page and how I did the contact page. And I'm not saying that the way that I did it is the way you have to do it. I'm not saying that the way that I did it is the best way of doing it. I'm saying that I'm going to show you the way that I did it for writing the BMI page and the way that I did it for writing the contact page. So for lack of better words, this is going to represent your test for this section. There'll be no homework, there'll be just a test. So you'll be graded on, does it work and does it put these 4 pages in here? As I put at the end of this too, the content shown are just suggestions. Ideally, I would like each of you to design your own site. Design it yourself, use your own colors, your own images, your own font, and of course, your own content. So what I'm saying here is I'll expect to be basically these kinds of fields. I don't want there to be a first name field and a button is what I'm saying. All right. And yours will probably look something like this. But if you want to change it around a little bit for whatever reason, then do it. Totally fine. But I want this to be a professional looking site and I want it to be a responsive site. Now, I didn't say it on here, but, or did I? Let's see. Yes, fully responsive. So I'm expecting you to use Grid and or Flexbox. You'll get some time to work on it today. You'll probably get some time to work on it tomorrow. Thursday will be lab. Tomorrow, I'm going to give you a couple more things I'd like you to try to do on your own. Tomorrow, if I get it done, tomorrow we're going to work on a couple API programs. If for some reason I don't get them done, then we're going to write some code together as a class. But either way, you can plan on writing some code tomorrow. The other thing that I sent you, and again, I'll have to change my share.
Mr. Scott.
Yes.
So for the BMI page, the calculator, does it have to be a BMI calculator, or it can be like any type of like calculator, like what we choose?
If let me answer this, and you tell me if I'm answering your question or not. All right. When I show you the way that I did it on Friday, as long as I'm using some DOM methods, etc., and as long as you use those, if you want it to be a regular calculator, you can do that.
Okay.
All right.
And wait.
Go ahead.
My next question is for the contact page. Do we have to use like HTML, or can we use like a job form? I'm just curious.
I don't really want it to be a jot form because with a lot of that stuff, you don't have to write anything.
Right. Okay,
and I want you to get used to going in and doing validation.
Okay.
All right. All right. So let me go back to the share again and bring up the other one, which was that array exercise. That's this. So again, these were both sent to you. Notice that at the top it says not to be turned in. But I want you to try these, and I've tried to give you at least some hints. Use an array map method. So in other words, for number 1 here, you'll want to be able to use map, and you'll notice there's some blank spaces either at the beginning or at the end of these. I want you to get those blank spaces out so it looks like this. So I want you to turn this array into this array. And I want you to do that via the map method. There are other ways that you could do it. Now, I'm looking in here, I spelled kilometers wrong. That's nice. So for the second one, write a function that converts the values of an array, all right, from miles to kilometers, again, using the map method. So some of this stuff there is very similar to programs we've done either in the AWD1111 class or the AWD1111 class. But I want you to get used to writing some functions And you'll notice, for example, here, square and sum the array elements using an arrow function and then find the average in an array. You say, well, there's no array there. Make one up. That's all I'm expecting. You can make an array with 3 elements in it, 3 numbers, and then write an arrow function that finds the average and it finds the sum. All right. And there's different ways that this can be done. And a lot of these are going to be very similar to one another. All right. We get down to number 5. From the array of numbers that you're working on here, compute the double of each one and do the sum, but use filter, map, and reduce. All right. So you can make up, if I don't show you the array to use, make up your own. You should try to put enough elements into it where you should be challenging yourself here. You're not turning this in. Create a new array right here, where each element is the uppercase of whatever was in the array. So make yourself 5 or 6 words and make them all uppercase. This one right here, number 7, is probably the hardest. And it says convert this into this. All right. And you can do that using the map method. Again, you'll get the answers to all of these on Friday. All right. So here I'll go through, and what you want to do is you want to create a new array, but you want to make sure that everything that's in this array, only put in the things that have words with more than 6 letters. Spray has 6, so you wouldn't include it. Limit has 5, so you wouldn't include it. Elite has 5, so you wouldn't include it, etc. All right. Then again, starting with an array that just has the numbers from 1 to 10, use filter, use map, and use reduce to do these things. Yeah, a lot of them are just almost busy work, but I want it where this becomes as natural to you as it possibly can. All right. And I showed you some examples of what the input and output should look like. All right. Then I asked, just so you can compare and contrast, do this, find the sum of all the elements using a regular standard for loop. Then go back and redo it using the reduce method. Then find the minimum and the maximum. There is a math.min function and a math.max function that you can run on those that makes it really easy. All right. Then do this, where you're going to basically double each one of these elements. Do it first using the old-fashioned for loop, and then redo it. All right. Reproduce it using the map function. All right. Same kind of thing here, but here it says print them using a for loop. Whoops. And print them using a for each loop. All right. Write a function using rest parameters. All right. Again, remember with rest parameters, I already showed you an example of that earlier. That's when you can pass in an array with a variable number of elements in it. So I call it once, pass in 5 elements, call it again, pass in 3 elements, etc. All right. Next, merge these 2 arrays shown, but merge them using the spread operator. There's other ways this could conceivably be done. We talked about the concat before, but I'm asking you to use the spread operator to do that. Number 15, use the spread operator again and convert this, which is a string array, basically, or just a string, convert it into a character array. All right, so you are basically taking this and exploding it into this. All right, finally use the spread operator in here to find the maximum and minimum values that are in here. Most of this should be, at least hopefully, fairly self-evident, as far as what we're doing. All right, so one more thing I want to do, and we'll be done in about 5 or 10 minutes for the day. I realize we're not going the entire time. I wanted to make sure to give you time each day. The first day, hopefully you had time to at least look at the Flexbox, Wes Bo's presentation, and to look at the grid West Bowes presentation. And if you didn't, you can do that today. You'll have some time tomorrow where you can finish that up and start working on this stuff and start working on your site. I don't want it said, hey, you never gave us any time to actually work on the homework in here. All right. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to do, let me grab this quickly. One thing that is, for lack of better words, and I'm not really stating it very well, but it's how I'm going to state it, and that is, that's kind of getting pushed on us here, is every class period, we are supposed to make sure that we go through the syllabus and we go through what we talked about for the day. Notice, review JavaScript. I'm not really going to do a bootstrap review. There are plenty of them out there. Brad Traversy has got a bootstrap crash course that's about, I don't know, it must be about an hour long, and there's other ones. When we get into where we're using React, about halfway or a little more into the course, we're going to be using React Bootstrap. What is that? It's Bootstrap that's been designed to be used with React. All right, that's why I want you to go back and refamiliarize yourself with that. So again, by here, you should be able to go, by the end of the day, you should be working on this stuff. So for tomorrow, I'm just going to change this on the fly right now. All right. So rather than doing this review, okay, we're going to basically come in here and look at using JavaScript, let's say client side, JavaScript with APIs, with application program interfaces. All right. So then when we get into this day right here, this is going to end up, both of these days will end up being lab, at least mostly lab. But again, once we get into Monday, move that down. Once we get into Monday, which will be the 29th, I believe. So once we get in there, no, I'm going to have to change this. This is going to say, rather than continue discussion of JavaScript, this will say begin discussion of MySQL. So because I'm trying again to keep in lockstep with the way that it's being done from Mr. Gudmisted. All right. Hopefully you have no questions on anything we've gone over these last 2 days, or if you have, either A, you have already asked those questions, or B, you will send me an email afterwards with any questions that you have. All right. So you've got about an hour today, a little, really over an hour and 15 minutes today, that you can, again, either finish up those West Bowes presentations, or you can go out and start working on the homework that I just gave you. All right. Any questions on anything we've done yesterday or today? All right. Then I will talk to you tomorrow. I'll see you then.